Hi Quilty friends, it's Martha at Be Quilting, and I'm here to show you how to use the Tucker trimmer. Okay, the Tucker trimmer is used to make half square triangles, quarter square triangles, and other combination units. This video will just address half square triangles. Okay, the Tucker trimmer looks like this. There's actually 3 versions of it. They're all used exactly the same way. They're just meant to be used on different size blocks. The Tucker Trimmer 1 trims up whole blocks, in other words, whole inches, half inches. The Tucker Trimmer 2 does 1/4 and 3/4 inches. And the Tucker Trimmer 3 does larger blocks, okay, in wholes and halves only.
Sorry about the glare.
Okay, so we're just going to use the Tucker Trimmer 1, but remember, they're all used exactly the same way. Okay, doesn't matter which one you're using, the method is the same. Okay, the first thing is we have to look at the directions, and in the directions you get this chart. Okay, to use the chart you need to know a couple things. First, it has both finished size of pieced unit and cut size. Finished size refers to the size it will be when it's completely surrounded by other blocks in your quilt. Cut size is the size when I get done sewing it together and I'm ready to sew it into my quilt. That's the cut size. So that's usually what you use as your guideline, because patterns don't usually refer to a finished size. They refer to the size it should be as you're working with it. So that's cut size. And then this tells you what size to cut your squares. You always start with squares for half square triangles, and you always start with 2 squares exactly the same size. Okay, so if you're making half square triangles, this is the size that you would cut your squares. If you're making combination units, this is the size, and if you're making quarter square triangles. So it depends on what your end product is going to be. We're just going to make half square triangles today. Okay, what we need to know about half square triangles is that if I start with 2 squares, I'm going to end up with 2 half square triangles. If I start with 8 squares of fabric and sew them together, I'm going to end up with 8 half square triangles. It took me a long time to figure that out. It seems really simple and obvious, but that's how it goes. These 2 will become 2 pieces that look like that. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. Now, I've started here with 6-inch blocks, and I'm making half square triangles. So here, for a 6-inch block, that means when I'm done making it, it'll be 5.5 inches, and when I sew it into my quilt, it'll be 5 inches. Okay? Just in other words, you're taking off the seam allowances. So I'm starting with a 6-inch block, so when I'm done today, we'll have a 5.5-inch block. All right. So you take one of the 2. So if I had 8 here, I'd take 4 of them that I want to put together, and I'm going to draw a double line down the middle. Okay? I'm going to use this handy dandy thing, which is called a magic wand, and you put it on corner to corner, and then I'm going to draw on both sides. So I have 2 lines which are 1/4 of an inch on either side of the perfect diagonal. If you notice, I have some sandpaper, some really fine sandpaper underneath. If you put sandpaper underneath, it helps to hold the magic wand, and it helps the pen not to drag. So I'm going to mark on both sides.
It's hard to see, but there's a line etched down the very middle of the magic wand, and that's what she's got lined up.
Yeah, see the
from
line?
corner to corner.
It's very difficult to see,
Yeah,
but it's easy to
glare.
see
Yeah.
when you're working.
If you have a magic wand, it's easy to see. It's just the glare and the shiny acrylic ruler.
Whoop, it moved. My sandpaper failed me.
You're holding
Okay.
it funny.
So there's my 2 lines. Okay, and I'm going to sew on those lines. Now, it can be helpful if you sew just barely to the inside of the line. So either sew exactly on it or to the inside of it. Don't sew to the outside. You'll make your half square triangle a little bit smaller, and you won't have much to trim, and it makes it a little more difficult. And I'm going to put them right sides together, and I'm going to sew on these 2 lines. Okay, and don't worry about back stitching, because you're going to trim it up anyway, so you just cut it off. And I'm just going to put a couple of pins just so I can get it over to my machine. Okay, and now I know some of you are thinking, what size seam allowance? You don't have one because you're just going to sew on the line. Okay, so whatever foot you like to sew on the line. Okay, and I'm using kind of a dark gray thread. I usually probably wouldn't use this. I'd use something a little lighter weight, but I want you to be able to see what's going on. So I'm going to sew just barely to the inside of the line that I drew. And I'm going to sew on both lines. Okay, don't let it fade at the end. Okay, don't let it fade at the end. You want to go all the way to the starting and ending points exactly either on the line or just barely to the inside. Every step is important, so be as accurate as you possibly can in your cutting and in your stitching on the line. Okay, so now both lines are stitched, and I always trim now before I put the iron on it because I like to have the dark marks that I made. It's easier to see that I'm sure that I'm in between them, and okay, and I'm going corner to corner. And I know that didn't cut right there. Okay. All right, now I'm going to press these open. Now, as far as pressing them, I always press them open to trim them up. Even if later I repress them a different direction for some reason, I always press them open to trim because it's much easier to trim them open. They lay much flatter. If you press them to one side, they're bulky, and the ruler has that little bit of rocking to it, and that can make it more difficult. Okay, be sure that it's pressed flat. Check from the other side, because you want this nice and flat. You don't want to distort the size of it. Okay, so now my line, my marking line is gone, but I don't need it anymore. And now all we have to do is use the Tucker trimmer to trim these up to the exact size that we want them to be. Okay? Let's take a look at the ruler. All right? You always want it face up. In other words, be able to read. If you can't read them, you've got it upside down. The other thing is I've put Invisigrip on the back of this because they are not non-slip rulers. Okay? So you want to be able to see the words. Okay, notice that there's a whole dot here and a half dot there. That means that if I'm trimming this to a whole inch size, I want this dot up. If I'm trimming it to a ½ inch size, I want this dot up. And remember, the size I'm going for is the cut size. So I'm going for a cut size of 5½ inches. So I'm going to use the side with the half dot. Okay, now, let's see, how are we going to position this so you can see it?
I'll come around.
Okay, so you see it like I see it. All right, you're going to do 2 cuts, okay, both using this ruler, okay, and what you're looking for is, notice people say, oh, well, that's wasteful. You cut it bigger than you need it. But look, what you're barely skimming off. See the tiny little bit? Just enough to square this up to the exact size I want it. So I'm going to put this line on the diagonal, because with half square triangles, the most important thing is that these seam lines go exactly into the corner. That way, when I put them with another half square triangle and sew it a ¼ inch, those line up. So that's what's important. So here's what I'm checking for before I make this first cut. Okay, that I'm exactly on that line so that my diagonals are going into the corners, that I have a little bit to skim off on these 2 sides, and that when I turn it, I'm going to have a little bit to skim off here. Okay, that's all I need, is just a tiny bit to trim.
And I know it looks like that diagonal is slightly off. That's the glare again from the lights.
Yeah, because it's right on.
Yep.
Okay, so now you trim 2 sides, these 2 sides. All right, And I like the point up. I like this angle better than to try and do it squared, because then I get confused which sides I'm doing. Where if I put this point up, I don't. The other thing that might be really useful is if you have a rotating cutting mat. Because
Which we have for sale in the shop.
yes, which we do have for sale in the shop, because across the top like this is always a little difficult for me. So if it is for you, a rotating cutting mat will work. Okay, take a look, make sure you trimmed it nice and that you got everything off, that you didn't miss anything. Okay, I'm going to leave the ruler in this same position, and I'm going to turn this, so now this point, the one that still has the dog ears on it, comes up. And now I'm going to use the 5.5 inch mark to line up on the edges that I just trimmed, and I want the diagonal again to be exactly into the corners. Okay? We'll do this one more time because I have one more. Because remember, we started with 2 squares of fabric, so we end up with 2 half square triangles. So we'll do it one more time. That little dog ear does not want to come off.
I think you need a new blade.
Maybe before I'm not going to do that because I'm going to make a chewy mess out of that. Okay, one more time. This up, my half circle up because I'm trimming to 5.5. I put this on the diagonal. The first cut, I'm just lining up the diagonal, but see, look, I don't have anything to trim, so I'm going to push it up a little more on the diagonal.
You want it outside all the lines.
Yes, I want a little bit out here, which you maybe can't see, but there is a little bit there, and I can see this better. And then see, I have a little bit here and a little bit here, and that's all I need. Okay? Wait, my diagonal's a little moved. Okay. Your weight on it, because you do not want this to move. See, that dog ear comes off really nice. This one's stubborn.
Maybe you need a friend to stand on the other side of the table and cut that stuff.
Maybe. Well, that would work too if you're in class. Okay. Keep my ruler the same way and bring my dog-eared one up to the top to the point that I'm cutting. Okay, now I put the 5.5 inch mark on the sides that I just trimmed and the diagonal line exactly on the seam line. And fuss with it a little. This is where take a little extra time and fuss. Make sure that you've got it right on there, exactly the way it's supposed to be before you cut. And now look, I'm just skimming off a little bit. See? Not much, but enough to count. Enough to know that now this is a perfect 5.5 inch block. All but that little dog ear that won't come off. We're going to do this again. There. That one came off. I'm going to trim this one with the scissors. Okay? So I have 2 perfect 5.5 inch half square triangles ready to go into my quilt. If you have any questions, stop by the shop. We'll be glad to show you how to do it.